Chapter 10. Intergroup Competition Shapes Cultural Evolution. In the forests of Uganda, primatologists have been studying a particularly large troop of chimpanzees at Ngogo for about 2 decades. As of 1999, this group of 150 or so individuals controlled a territory of 29 square kilometers, 11.2 square miles. As in other chimpanzee groups, adult males go out on boundary patrols. During these nighttime expeditions, but unlike their other movements, males neither socialize nor feed, but silently travel in single file through regions separating their territory from that occupied by adjacent chimpanzee troops. There, moving along the border, they sometimes make targeted incursions into the territories of other troops. Over 9 years, 114 of these patrols attacked and killed 21 members of other chimpanzee troops. 13 of these 21 murders occurred during incursions into the northeastern corner of their territory, and thus targeted one particular troop. While the exact size of this other group is uncertain, this many kills implies that about 3/4 of the chimpanzees in the other group can expect to be murdered by a patrol before dying of old age at 50. In 2009, Ngogo chimpanzees, including females and infants, began regularly entering this new territory and acting as they do at the core of their own territory. It appears that their systematic raids over at least a decade drove the other troop back, allowing this large group to effectively expand its territory by 22.3%. The presence of substantial and deadly intergroup competition and territorial expansion in one of our closest primate relatives suggests that it may be old, even older than our species' heavy reliance on cultural learning. Cultural evolution may have emerged in a world in which intergroup competition was already prevalent. When our genetically evolving capacities for cultural learning began to give rise to cultural evolution and social norms, it's likely that our species was already living in stable social groups. Many of these norms would have been arbitrary, such as using a particular type of stone for smashing nuts open. But occasionally, pro-social norms might have emerged that fostered food sharing, internal harmony, no fighting or no stealing others' mates, or cooperative efforts in community defense. But how could such systems of social norms have culturally evolved to perform this function? As we discussed in Chapter 9, many social norms appear almost engineered to harness and extend our social instincts. Yet few, if any, adherents to these norms understand the design or implicit function of their institutions. Intergroup competition provides one important process that can help explain the spread of norms that foster prosociality. Different groups culturally evolve different social norms. Having norms that increase cooperation can favor success in competition with other groups that lack these norms. Over time, intergroup competition can aggregate and assemble packages of social norms that more effectively promote such success, and these packages will include social norms related to cooperation, helping, sharing, and maintaining internal harmony. In just a moment, I discuss the most important categories of intergroup competition and highlight key lines of evidence. In Chapter 11, I'll consider how a long evolutionary history of living in a social world regulated by norms, which themselves were shaped by intergroup competition, influenced our species' genetic evolution. Once a new norm emerges in one group, intergroup competition can grab hold of it and spread it widely through a number of related processes. Consider 5 forms of intergroup competition. 1. War and raiding. The first and most straightforward way that intergroup competition influences cultural evolution is through violent conflicts in which some social groups, due to institutions that foster greater cooperation or generate other technological, military, or economic advantages, drive out, eliminate, or assimilate other groups with different social norms. 2. Differential group survival without conflict. In sufficiently harsh environments, only groups with institutions that promote cooperation, sharing, and internal harmony can survive at all and spread. Groups without these norms go extinct or flee back into more amicable environments. The right institutions allow groups to enter new ecological niches, for example, by fostering survival in the Arctic through cooperation in whale hunting, or by surviving shocks like droughts in deserts that would exterminate or disperse less cooperative groups. Groups with superior institutions simply outlast and eventually replace those with fewer cooperation galvanizing norms. Since humans expanded out of Africa and into harsh environments for which they had few genetic adaptations or innate proclivities, this may have been particularly important during human evolution. For this kind of process to work, groups don't ever have to meet each other, and violence between groups need not occur. 3. Differential migration. Since social norms can create groups with greater internal harmony, cooperation, and economic production, many individuals will be inclined to migrate into more successful groups from less successful ones. Meanwhile, few will want to move to less successful groups unless forced to. Over time, the more successful groups will expand through immigration, whereas other groups will contract through emigration. This movement has been observed in both the differential rates of switching groups at boundaries of small-scale tribal populations and in migration patterns among nations in the modern world. 4. Differential reproduction. Under some conditions, social norms can influence the rate at which individuals within a group produce children. Since children tend to share the norms of their group, over time the social norms of groups who produce children at faster rates will tend to spread at the expense of other social norms. Some modern religions, for example, take advantage of this with their pronatalist gods and fertility-favoring institutions. 5. Prestige-biased group transmission. Because of our cultural learning abilities, individuals will be inclined to preferentially attend to and learn from individuals in more successful groups, including those with social norms that lead to greater economic success or better health. This causes social norms, including ideas, beliefs, practices, for example, rituals, and motivations, to flow via cultural transmission from more successful groups to less successful groups. Since individuals cannot easily distinguish what makes a group more successful, there is a substantial amount of cultural flow that has nothing to do with success. For example, hairstyles and music preferences. Over time, combinations of these intergroup processes will aggregate and recombine different social norms to create increasingly pro-social institutions. To be clear, by pro-social institutions, I mean institutions that lead to success in competition with other groups. While such institutions include those that increase group cooperation and foster internal harmony, I do not mean good or better in a moral sense. To underline this point, realize that intergroup competition often favors norms and beliefs that can readily result in the tribe or nation in the next valley getting labeled as animals, non-humans, or witches, and motivate efforts to exterminate them. How old is intergroup competition? How important was intergroup competition in shaping the culturally evolved institutions of our Paleolithic ancestors? Has it been shaping cultural evolution for long enough to have had an impact on our genetic evolution? Several converging lines of evidence, though all admittedly indirect, suggest that intergroup competition was probably important for much of our species' evolutionary history. To triangulate in on this, we'll first look at non-human primates, since at some point in the past we were just another primate species, so they provide a point of departure. Next, since our ancestors lived in societies very different from today's modern nation-states, we will examine small-scale societies and focus especially on hunter-gatherers. While none of these societies is in any sense representative of Paleolithic populations, they collectively provide much insight into the broad patterns and potential diversity of ancestral human societies who faced the same problems, used similar technologies, and relied on many of the same resources. Finally, we consider these lines of evidence in light of paleoanthropological efforts to reconstruct the lifeways of human ancestors. This work draws insights from both the unearthed tools and bones of past populations and from reconstructions of ancient environments, which draw on data from ice and lake cores that help resolve long-term patterns of environmental change. As I discuss intergroup competition, keep in mind that there are many other cultural evolutionary forces that do not favor pro-social institutions. When the forces of intergroup competition are spent or weakened, success-biased cultural learning, or purely rational self-interest, will cause individuals to seek out any cracks in their group's institutions to manipulate or exploit for their own benefit or that of their kith and kin. Over time, history suggests that all pro-social institutions age and eventually collapse at the hands of self-interest, unless they are renewed by the dynamics of intergroup competition. That is, although it may take a long time, individuals and coalitions eventually figure out how to beat or manipulate the system to their own ends, and these techniques spread and slowly corrode any pro-social effects. Let's start with intergroup conflict via warfare and raiding. As we discussed at the outset of this chapter, chimpanzees have violent intergroup conflicts that can result in significant gains and losses of territory. Aggressive intergroup interactions are common in many primate species, but chimpanzees are particularly interesting because they provide a ready model for what the common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees might have been like. If modern chimpanzees do it, it's plausible that the common primate ancestor we share with chimpanzees also did it. The mortality rate we saw at Ngogo is unusually high, but data from other sites suggests that mortality rates from chimpanzee intergroup conflicts range from 4% to 13%, which, we will discover, is comparable to many small-scale human societies. Aside from Ngogo, intergroup aggression has been well documented at 4 chimpanzee sites, and territorial expansions have been observed in 2 other populations besides the one at Ngogo. While chimpanzees do reveal some behavioral patterns that probably represent cultural traditions, no reliable evidence so far suggests that they have social norms, and certainly no norms that promote success in intergroup competition. This suggests that intergroup competition may have preceded the emergence of cultural evolution and could have started shaping norms as soon as they began to emerge. However, even if intergroup competition did not exist initially, cultural evolution would have created the know-how to exploit clumped resources, which could be defended and controlled, and social norms that would have given rise to differences among groups, imbalances of power, that would have generated intergroup competition. Of course, it's possible that during the course of human evolution, something happened to suppress intergroup competition. So we need to ask whether small-scale societies, and particularly hunter-gatherer groups, really do experience intergroup competition. Conveniently, one form of intergroup competition in small-scale societies, warfare, is actually a hot topic. The answer is that there's lots of conflict and lots of variability in conflict rates. And while it's certainly true that farming and herding societies fight much more than most hunter-gatherers, substantial evidence indicates that many hunter-gatherer populations experienced enduring violent conflicts between groups that inflicted high mortality rates and much loss of territory. Reviews of the evidence for warfare among hunter-gatherers show that 70% to 90% of these societies experience war or raiding as either continuous, with conflicts every year, or frequent, with conflicts at least once every 5 years. Estimates of the percentage of deaths directly due to violent intergroup conflicts average 15% based on ethnographic observations and 13% based on archaeological studies of cemeteries. Remember, chimp death rates ranged from 4% to 13%. These percentages are very high compared to the same rates in the United States or Europe in the 20th century, where the numbers are all less than 1%, but low compared with many pre-industrial agricultural societies. Beyond the loss of life, conflict among hunter-gatherer populations resulted in the systematic gain and loss of territory, and thus resources, over time. In the 5 groups for which there is ethno-historical data, gains and losses in territory ranged from 3% to 50% per generation, 25 years, with an average of 16%. We might worry about these numbers, since 4 of the 5 groups derive from Western North America, and thus may have been influenced in their territorial expansion by agriculturalists, at least indirectly. However, even if we take the 3%, which comes from the Warlpiri, who lived in the middle of a vast continent of hunter-gatherers in Australia, a territory of 100 square miles would more than double every 600 years. In 5,000 years, which is brief given the more than 2 million years since the origins of the genus Homo, a territory the size of the original Washington, D.C., 100 square miles, would expand to the size of Indiana, 36,417 square miles. In another 5,000 years or so, a group expanding at this rate could displace enough other groups to cover all of Asia. In short, 3% per generation is plenty fast. To be clear, conflicts among nomadic foragers were very different from war in more complex societies. Most conflicts involved raids or ambushes, which relied on stealth, surprise, and superior numbers to mitigate the risks. Attackers typically came out much better than the victims, at least in the short run, until the victims sought revenge with stealth raids of their own. Pitched battles did occur, and sometimes involved hundreds of individuals on a side, but these were relatively rare. Groups often experienced enduring periods of hostility with neighboring groups, in which strangers were killed on sight and maintained a no-man's land, a kind of DMZ, between them. These patterns are reminiscent of chimpanzees, except, crucially, this hostility usually occurred between tribal populations, which consisted of many interlinked bands who shared customs and language, rather than between residential groups, as in chimpanzees. That is, intergroup conflict occurred on a much bigger scale in humans. There's reason to suspect that the Paleolithic world may have been even more prone to such intergroup conflicts than these historical and ethnographic data suggest. This is because of the much more intense climatic fluctuations experienced over most of our evolutionary history compared to the last 10,000 years of relatively stable climates. Not only were ancient populations dealing with constantly shifting seasons and rising and falling seas, but they would have been hit more frequently by immense storms, floods, fires, and droughts. Two kinds of evidence indicate that these shifts would have sparked more war. First, the archaeological record of California's maritime hunter-gatherer populations over a 7,000-year period shows that violence is most common during periods of climatic shifts, which stress resources. Second, quantitative analyses on warfare using ethnographic data from both a global sample of diverse small-scale societies and a regional sample from East Africa indicate that unpredictable environments probably cause more warfare between groups. Thus, unpredictable environments, which characterized the Paleolithic, likely intensified intergroup competition. Intergroup competition also often shapes the cultural evolution of institutions without violence or war. To see one mechanism, let's look at a case in which a village in New Guinea decided explicitly to copy the institutions of a regionally more successful group, including the practices, rituals, and beliefs. Throughout the highlands of New Guinea, a group's ability to raise large number of pigs is directly related to its economic and social success in competition with other regional groups. The ceremonial exchange of pigs allows groups to forge alliances, repay debts, obtain wives, and generate prestige through excessive displays of generosity. All this means that groups who are better able to raise pigs can expand more rapidly in numbers, by reproduction and in-migration, and thus have the potential to expand their territory. Group size is very important in intergroup warfare in small-scale societies, so larger groups are more likely to successfully expand their territory. However, the prestige more successful groups obtain may cause the rapid diffusion of the very institutions, beliefs, and practices responsible for their competitive edge, as other groups adopt their strategies and beliefs. In 1971, the anthropologist David Boyd was living in the New Guinea village of Irakia and observed intergroup competition via prestige-biased group transmission. Concerned about their low prestige and weak pig production, the senior men of Irakia convened a series of meetings to determine how to improve their situation. Numerous suggestions were proposed for raising their pig production, but after a long process of consensus building, the senior men of the village decided to follow a suggestion made by a prestigious clan leader who proposed that they must follow the foray and adopt their pig-related husbandry practices, rituals, and other institutions. The foray were a large and successful ethnic group in the region who were renowned for their pig production. The following practices, beliefs, rules, and goals were copied from the foray and announced at the next general meeting of the community. 1. All villagers must sing, dance, and play flutes for their pigs. This ritual causes the pigs to grow faster and bigger. At feasts, the pigs should be fed first from the oven. People are fed second. 2. Pigs should not be killed for breaking into another's garden. The pig's owner must assist the owner of the garden in repairing the fence. Disputes will be resolved following the dispute resolution procedure used among the foray. 3. Sending pigs to other villages is taboo, except for the official festival feast. 4. Women should take better care of the pigs and feed them more food. To find extra time for this, women should spend less time gossiping. 5. Men must plant more sweet potatoes for the women to feed to the pigs, and should not depart for wage labor in distant towns until the pigs have grown to a certain size. The first two items were implemented immediately at a ritual feast. David stayed in the village long enough to verify that the villagers did adopt the other practices and that their pig production did increase in the short term, though unfortunately we don't know what happened in the long run. Let me highlight three features of this case. First, the real causal links between many of these elements and pig production are unclear. Maybe singing does cause pigs to grow faster, but it's not obvious, and no one tried to ascertain this fact via experimentation, for example. Second, the village leadership chose to rely on copying institutions from other groups and not on designing their own institutions from scratch. This is smart, since we humans are horrible at designing institutions from scratch. And third, this transmission between groups occurred rapidly because the Iroquois already had a political institution in the village, which involved a council of the senior members of each clan, who were empowered by tradition, social norms, to make community-level decisions. Lacking such a decision-making institution, foray practices would have had to spread among households, and thus been much slower in spreading. Of course, such political decision-making institutions themselves are favored by intergroup competition. More broadly, this case is not unique in any way, as much ethnography and ethnohistory from New Guinea and elsewhere indicates that the copying of institutions and rituals from more successful groups is commonplace. For example, an in-depth study of the Enga, a small-scale agricultural population in the New Guinea highlands, reveals the effects of intergroup competition on the spread of ritually galvanized sets of norms and political beliefs, termed cults, that promote identity, welfare, and unity among local communities. These institutional packages often included the psychologically potent and terrifying initiation rites described in Chapter 9. According to the ethnographers Polly Wiesner and Akii Tumu, these cults were readily transmitted across linguistic boundaries when 1. Donors and recipients faced comparable problems so that underlying beliefs and overt procedures were meaningful, and 2. The owners of the cults were perceived as being successful. Cults were imported in order to acquire new and more effective ways to communicate with the spirit world, as well as to emulate those who appeared more successful. In some cases, less successful communities would go to more successful communities and pay them, often in pigs, to learn about their rituals and institutions in order to better ascertain the crucial details. Elsewhere, in the Sepik region of New Guinea, villages typically break down after they exceed about 300 people, as squabbling clans fracture and move apart. However, one Arapesh community named Ilahita dramatically exceeded the size of all other villages in this region, maintaining an ethnically diverse population of 1,500 people. The ability to sustain solidarity in this locally immense population led to both success and security in a region with substantial military and economic threats. The anthropologist Donald Tuzin studied Ilahita in detail in order to determine how it managed to sustain such a large size when other communities could not. He found that in the last century, Ilahita had adopted a ritually galvanized form of social organization ensconced in an encompassing mystical belief system. This package reorganized the community to create cross-cutting mutual interdependencies among subgroups that were then sacralized in rituals. The basic elements of this institutional ritual complex, which Ilahita elaborated upon, were first copied around 1870 from a highly successful and aggressively expanding group called the Abellum. Their acquisition, retrofitting, and apparent improvement of the Abellum package permitted Ilahita to stand against this group and has since led to both military and economic success. Ilahita has also grown through the in-migration and assimilation of refugees fleeing from hostile neighbors, which represents a case of intergroup competition via differential migration. These ethnographically rich cases suggest that increasingly effective social bonding rituals spread over time, along with rising community size and political complexity, and that this societal evolution may have been driven by the rising intensity of military and economic competition. The suggestion fits with recent cross-cultural statistical analyses of small-scale societies, showing that more warfare is associated with the presence of more terrifying and costlier rights for males. In many cases, the threat of war seems to drive the spread of rituals via prestige-biased group transmission, so these two forms of intergroup competition combine synergistically to favor more cooperative cultural forms. The presence of violent conflicts, territorial losses and gains, and the wholesale copying of institutions from more successful groups show us that some of the crucial elements of intergroup competition are not only present, but also common, even in the smallest scale human societies. However, these ethnographic cases don't tell us if these relatively short-term interactions matter over the longer run for cultural evolution, over centuries or millennia, in ways that systematically shape institutions, forms of social organization, and ultimately social psychology. Did intergroup competition shape the social worlds that our genes and psychology faced over the long run during human evolution? Hunter-gatherer expansions. Currently, there is relatively little evidence of some groups of hunter-gatherers expanding at the expense of other groups of hunter-gatherers over centuries or millennia. Part of the reason for this is that most of the available evidence for one group systematically spreading involves farmers or herders expanding at the expense of foragers or other groups of farmers and herders. Many of these population expansions can be traced either to institutions or forms of social organization, or to technological differences, or to both. As I show in Chapter 12, the size and complexity of a group's suite of tools, weapons, and other technologies are heavily influenced by the group's social institutions, so sustained technological differences cannot be neatly partitioned from institutional differences. The massive success of farmers in taking over the globe thousands of years ago has made it hard to spot the older expansions of hunter-gatherer groups. This has led some to think that sustained expansions via intergroup competition remain a peculiar condition of farming and herding societies, an affliction to which mobile hunter-gatherers are immune. However, if hunter-gatherer expansions are important, then we should be able to spot them when we look at the parts of the globe that farmers and herders either couldn't get to or didn't get to until late in the game. This will take us to Australia, a continent of hunter-gatherers until Europeans arrived, the Arctic, and the Great Basin of western North America. Unlike potential cases of hunter-gatherer expansions found deep in the archaeological record, these more recent expansions allow us to combine linguistic, archaeological, genetic, and ethnographic evidence, and thereby generate a richer picture of what happened. The Pama-Nyungan spread. In Australia, we saw that the Warlpiri were increasing their territory by 3% per year. However, this doesn't tell us if that rate could be sustained for, say, 5,000 years. Maybe groups variously gain and lose over centuries with no net effect. Crucially, it turns out that the Warlpiri are part of the distinctive Pama-Nyungan language family. This single language family covers 7/8 of Australia. All of the other roughly 24 language families of indigenous Australian languages were crowded into the remaining 1/8 of the continent, all in the north, just west of the Gulf of Carpentaria, where Burke and Wills went. This linguistic patterning, along with the more detailed analyses of the Pama-Nyungan family itself, reveals a well-known linguistic signature, one that usually marks an expansion. These analyses indicate that the Pama-Nyungan expansion began in northwestern Queensland between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago, and gradually spread over most of the continent. This linguistic picture is enriched by archaeological, epidemiological, genetic, and ethnographic data. From the archaeological perspective, at about the same time as this linguistic expansion was occurring, new and different stone tools began appearing across Australia, including distinctive backed blades. The distribution of these new tools roughly matches the distribution of Pama-Nyungan languages. New plant foods also began appearing that, like Nardoo, require complex preparations, such as the grinding of various seeds. Though they are rather labor-intensive, these new food sources could be stored, gradually accumulated, and eventually used to feed large gatherings. Not coincidentally, evidence also suggests that large ceremonial gatherings became common, the population density increased, and people moved into new, challenging, and inhospitable environments. Studies of stone tools and their geographic sources indicate the development of substantial trade networks and the intensification of exchange. This evidence suggests that languages, tools, rituals, and food preparation techniques spread across Australia, replacing or supplanting their alternatives. By combining all the available evidence, two linguists, Nick Evans and Patrick McConville, have proposed that the Pama-Nyungan speakers spread because of new 1. Patrilineal kinship institutions, 2. Marriage rules that prescribed unions outside the local group and possibly outside the dialect group, 3. Multi-group ritual gatherings or ceremonies supported by seed processing and storage capabilities, 4. Intensive initiation rites for adolescents, as we saw among the Arunta, and 5. More encompassing cosmologies conveyed through song cycles that established sacred group identities, which saved Peralji's band in Chapter 8. These kinship, marriage, and ritual institutions involved social norms that tightly bound males from different residential groups in interdependent social webs. The marriage norms of dialect exogamy meant that men had to seek wives from groups speaking different languages or dialects. This created an incentive to build relationships with other groups and forced local groups to remain integrated into larger populations. As discussed in Chapter 9, the emotional impact of these new rites might have fostered solidarity among local bands and, especially, bound male adolescents together for life. Both the wide-ranging affinal ties and large ceremonial gatherings created by these social norms would also have fostered better technologies and more adaptive cultural repertoires through the exchange of information about tools, weapons, skills, food sources, and medicines. Similarly, large ceremonies would have institutionalized technology transfer, as young men learned complex skills from the most skilled members of all participating groups. Without social norms demanding such ceremonies, which required diverse groups, the population's ability to develop and sustain a large repertoire of complex technologies would have been inhibited. Recall that the Arunta believed failure to heed the ritual summons would result in illness. One key question is whether this expansion involved violent conflict, biased migration into successful groups, prestige-biased group copying, or one of the other mechanisms through which intergroup competition operates. Sparse as it is, the available evidence indicates that several of these mechanisms were at work. First, the genetic comparisons of Australian Aboriginal populations suggest that speakers of Pama-Nyungan languages are often, but not always, genetically distinct from speakers of other languages. Paralleling this, Pama-Nyungan speakers tend to have high rates of the retrovirus HTLV1, while non-Pama-Nyungan have low rates. HTLV1 is principally transmitted through breast milk, which means that mothers pass it to their children with very little transmission occurring between tribal groups. This suggests that, in part, the competition occurred through the replacement of people, suggesting either differential reproduction or violent conflict, or both. Accompanying these forms of competition, however, ethnographic and ethno-historical data indicate that both differential migration and prestige-biased group transmission were probably also important parts of this spread, especially in light of the weak, sometimes non-existent, relationship between language and genes, or retroviruses. While we can't be sure that some of these ancient norms, beliefs, and practices spread by being copied from group to group, we do have more recent cases that catch this process in action, as new kin-based institutions and rituals have been observed to emerge and get systematically and repeatedly copied by neighboring groups. For example, over about 60 years, a particular rite of male circumcision diffused out of the Kimberleys to Arnhem Land, the Great Australian Bight, and eventually to Queensland. Similarly, new and even more complicated sets of marriage rules spread widely in parts of Australia when two groups integrated their kinship and marriage systems. The more complex, recombinant institution that emerged probably fostered even greater integration across diverse groups than did its parent forms. Intergroup competition by differential survival in a challenging environment may have also played a role as Pama-Nyungan speakers eventually entered, or perhaps re-entered, the uninhabited and hostile environments of the Western Desert. Here, where earlier arrivals hadn't endured, groups bearing this new package of social norms and rituals, which permitted widely scattered bands to remain socially interconnected, could have survived more frequently when droughts or floods struck. As we discussed in Chapter 8, Peralji saved his band from the 1943 drought in the Western Desert by variously relying on the knowledge of distant water holes he had gained during his adolescent initiation rite, and on the rich song cycles he'd gradually memorized over decades of ritual performances. Of course, Burke and Wills couldn't even find water in the Australian desert when there wasn't a drought. The spread of the Inuit and the Numuk. The same kinds of processes of intergroup competition have also shaped hunter-gatherer institutions in the Arctic. On the north slope of Alaska, around the time of the Battle of Hastings in England, around 1000 CE, speakers of an Inuit Inupiaq language, the Inuit, began expanding eastward across the vast Canadian Arctic. In a few hundred years, these hunter-gatherers would colonize Greenland and move south into Labrador on the east coast of Canada. The territory they entered, however, was not empty. The Dorset Eskimo, an archaeologically and probably genetically distinct population who had long inhabited these regions, rapidly receded and vanished, mostly in the wake of the Inuit tide. The Inuit may also have driven out, or at least encouraged the speedy departure of, the Norse settlers they encountered and fought in Greenland. Compared to the Dorset, the archaeology shows that the Inuit, the Thule, had a more sophisticated technological repertoire. The Inuit arrived equipped with advantages that included powerful compound bows, high-quality adzes for woodworking, kayaks, dogs, sleds, and snow goggles. Along the coast, Inuit groups also had a full whaling package, which included skin boats and harpoons. Interestingly, the Dorset had had archery and dogs in the past, but had lost them centuries before encountering the advancing Inuit. Note, if you are skeptical that useful tools can be lost, stand by for Chapter 12. Socially, the Inuit probably also had the capability to rapidly organize men under a prestigious leader for economic endeavors like whale hunting and probably for raiding, warfare, and community defense. Their repertoire of cultural institutional technologies included flexible kinship norms, special namesake relationships, like the Juk-Wansi, rituals, and other bonding tools. For example, by providing his wife to another man for sex, an Inuit man could cement an enduring and mutually beneficial bond, even creating a special relationship between the men's children. Together, such institutional cultural technologies helped individuals and communities weave and sustain vast webs of social relationships across widely scattered populations. These networks were crucial for maintaining trade relationships and linguistic similarity, as well as for finding marriage partners and recruiting allies for defense and raiding, offense. As we'll discuss for the polar Inuit, a group's ability to sustain complex technologies depends on their sociality, on their ability to sustain broad-ranging social contacts. As with Pama-Nyungan peoples, ethnographic and ethno-historical evidence suggests that multiple forms of intergroup competition were likely afoot during the Inuit expansion. In terms of warfare, I suspect that the Inuit gradually occupied Dorset territories and outcompeted them for local resources. When conflict did eventually break out, the Dorset tended to lose and retreat. Neither the archaeological nor the linguistic evidence tells us if success in warfare influenced the Inuit expansion. However, ethno-historical evidence from northern Alaska shows that raiding was an ever-present feature of Arctic life, and even pitched battles were common. Devastating surprise attacks at dawn aimed to annihilate whole communities, and sometimes did. Ambushes sometimes wiped out large trading or hunting parties. Consequently, in this hunter-gatherer social environment, strangers were viewed with great suspicion and were usually killed, a fact that placed a premium on having lots of personal contacts in other communities. Differential extinction could also have played a role. With their superior technology and more diverse set of foraging strategies, the Inuit likely endured and adapted to changing environments and ecological shocks more effectively than the Dorset, and thus would have reproduced faster. Prior to the arrival of the Inuit, the Dorset seemed to have periodically gone extinct in particular regions. If the Inuits' institutional advantages meant that they went locally extinct less frequently than the Dorset, Inuit norms and practices would have spread and eventually come to dominate, even if the Inuit and Dorset never confronted each other violently. Some cultural transmission did occur between the Inuit and the Dorset. For example, archaeological evidence suggests that late Dorset populations were acquiring Inuit house designs. Researchers have also located a few isolated Arctic populations who are not genetically related to the Inuit, yet have clearly adopted many Inuit practices. These may be descendants of the Dorset. As in Australia, intergroup competition among foraging populations would have favored the spread of social institutions that permitted widely scattered small groups to sustain broad and enduring social relationships, and to pull together local teams to engage in cooperative activities like whaling, community defense, and raiding. Groups less effective at this, because of their social norms, would have lost to more capable groups. In this environment, intergroup competition would not have fostered trust and fairness toward strangers, but rather would have highlighted the need to sustain a tight social network of trusted allies, friends, and kin. The story was very much the same in North America's Great Basin. The Great Basin is a vast watershed between the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Between about 200 CE and 600 CE, Numuck-speaking hunter-gatherers expanded out of eastern California in a fan shape across the Great Basin. 3 Numuck groups, the Paiutes, Shoshone, and Utes, gradually replaced the pre-Numuck hunter-gatherers living there, as well as driving off some encroaching agricultural peoples at the fringes. Like their Australian counterparts, they were fueled by a combination of new forms of social organization and advanced technologies. Their flexible fission-fusion social organization and rituals permitted them not only to aggregate periodically for hunting, sharing information, making marriages, and raiding, but also to seasonally scatter as independent families for hunting, gathering, and defense. It's very hard to effectively attack mobile nuclear families. Unlike the foragers they replaced, these groups relied heavily on intensive plant processing techniques and stored foods, and fancy twined water containers that permitted them to both sustain higher population densities and to better withstand environmental shocks, like droughts. After 1650 CE, when Numuck groups first entered the historical record, they rapidly became renowned for their bravery and feared for their raiding parties and surprise attacks. During this period, Numuck groups drove out the non-Numuck inhabitants of both Warner and Surprise Valleys and seized the territory for themselves. One Numuck-speaking group, the Comanche, would eventually enter the Great Plains, adopt horses, and expand dramatically. The Comanche rapidly drove out other indigenous groups, most of which were farmers, and permanently pushed back the Spanish. These mobile hunting bands would come to dominate a vast territory and would only be driven back by another rapidly expanding group, the United States. Ancient expansions. These cases of intergroup competition, in which one group of hunter-gatherers expands at the expense of another group, or groups of hunter-gatherers, are rich in part because we know what these societies looked like at the earliest European contact, and we have some sense of their institutions, languages, and lifeways. However, archaeological evidence suggests that these kinds of expansions, on large and small scales, go deep into our species' evolutionary history. Over 1 million years ago, our genus expanded out of Africa into a vast range of Eurasian environments that were experiencing rapid climatic and ecological shifts. To the degree that survival in these evolutionarily new and harsh environments depended on cooperation or social networks to sustain technologies, like fire, bows and arrows, fishing, and clothing, differential extinction would have favored any culturally transmitted behaviors that fostered either. Around 60,000 years ago, groups of Homo sapiens expanded out of Africa, our lineage, this time at the expense of other members of our genus and species. As they did for the Pama-Nyungan speakers in more recent millennia in Australia, backed blades marked the expansion of these populations into Neanderthal-occupied Europe after 50,000 years ago. Like the Inuit, they may have advanced with the help of superior technology, specifically bows and arrows. These African varieties did interbreed to some degree with the other human lineages they encountered, but the Africans eventually replaced them culturally and dominated them genetically. This should now sound familiar. The archaeology can't tell us much about the processes behind these expansions, but the evidence of violence is consistent with some degree of warfare and raiding, as with chimpanzees. The recurrent presence of cannibalism among Paleolithic humans, which involved the consumption of fully grown adults, suggests violent intergroup conflicts. As is typical in these expansions, the European variants, that is, the Neanderthals, also appear to have been copying the newcomers from Africa, suggesting prestige-biased group cultural transmission. In more recent millennia, especially since the origins of plant and animal domestication some 12,000 years ago, the intensity of intergroup competition has dramatically escalated, driving the rise of increasingly large and complex societies. At the global level, Jared Diamond has argued that intergroup competition is crucial for explaining the expansion of particular agricultural groups around the globe, and that the elevated intensity of this competition in Europe, and Eurasia more broadly, helps explain why it was Europeans who conquered the world after 1500 CE, and not the Aztecs or Walpurgi. Overall, this combination of evidence suggests that intergroup competition, in a variety of forms that include nonviolent competition, has been shaping cultural evolution and the social worlds we live in for eons, well back into our species' evolutionary history. If this evidence provides even a roughly correct view, then intergroup competition, through its influence on the social norms, reputational systems, punishments, and institutions experienced by individuals, will have shaped our genetic evolution. Let's now turn to this process, which is a form of self-domestication.